this is a great opportunity to voice our concerns about, of course, what's going on in Sri Lanka at the moment, and the talks with IMF that are ongoing. We are concerned about governance and all the issues in Sri Lanka, and also how while IMF is sort of cited as the panacea for all our economic ills, how the austerity measures that are going to be part of the conditionalities would further erode social spending and violate all sorts of rights in the country, particularly economic and social rights. I'm not an expert in IMF negotiations and so on. So as Radhika pointed out, what I'm going to do is just to, provide the context for this discussion, what's going on in Sri Lanka and the debates that are going on in Sri Lanka in this regard. About how to, tide over these economic difficulties, but also how at the same time there is this massive protest movement in the country, which is asking for political system change. So we have to address all that, and IMF cannot be certainly oblivious to all these developments in Sri Lanka. So while we talk about the economic crisis in Sri Lanka, for some of us, this is really a manifestation of a crisis in governance. And I think it has a lot to do with the type of executive presidency we have, and particularly this presidency, which took office in 2019 November, which, straight away through the 20th Amendment to the Constitution, consolidated further powers in the presidency, removing a lot of checks and balances that were there, which we introduced through the 19th Amendment to the Constitution. So for some of us, when we analyze this economic crisis, what we see is that the absence of checks and balances, a president who can be very isolated from realities, who is so, so powerful that he or she, whoever holds that position, appoints almost everybody who matters in the country, from the prime minister to the cabinet, permanent secretaries, to superior court justices, independent commissions, the governor of the central bank, and so on and so forth. And with this vast array of powers, and to a great extent clothed with presidential immunity, it can go either way. A very enlightened, benevolent president can do good, but of course, we take our chances with that. But when it's authoritarianism, it really has a very serious impact. And what we've seen about the presidential system is this authoritarianism that has served Sri Lanka very negatively. So that I have to point out, because eventually now IMF says it also looks at governance and civil and political rights and so on. These factors also have to be taken into consideration. Where the economic crisis is concerned, I think Radhika gave a brief introduction to it. We are not in a position to service our external debts, which run to the tune of about $50 billion at the moment. This year, about $7 billion are due, but we have very, very little foreign currency reserves, so much so that yesterday, the governor of the central bank pointed out that we have foreign currency reserves just for a week's imports of essential items, which includes food, fuel, cooking gas, and the like. I mean, that's extremely frightening. So I think there are two issues here, two major policy debacles which contributed to this, although economists can, I'm sure there are many here who can contribute in a much more substantive way to the reasons for this economic crisis, aside from the governance issue. One was the removal of or reduction of the tax base. Because of the mounting external debt. I mean, the external debt is not particular to this government. It has been coming down for decades. Some governments borrowed more than others. And this government, the tax base, one of the first things this government did when the president took office in November 2019 was to announce tax reductions. mainly the sort of pay type of taxes, which favored the middle class and the higher income levels. And the taxation base currently is mostly direct taxation, which affects everybody, including the poor. So, for example, in the university sector, the taxes we pay is 1/5 of what we used to. Now, this was a political promise. It may be a gimmick. It may be done to favor certain, supporters of the ruling, the political class. Whatever it was, it has had a devastating impact because tax revenues have plummeted. Sri Lanka, anyway, has had very weak tax cover, but it is further eroded. The second was this very ill-conceived policy on fertilizer. Overnight, about a year ago, we were told, the government announced that the agriculture sector will have to convert from chemical fertilizer to organic fertilizer, which is a good thing in principle. But the point is, it was overnight and it is not going to work. So scientists did point out this is not going to work, do it gradually, but we did realize it was introduced overnight because there were no foreign currency reserves to pay for the fertilizer, the chemical fertilizer, and the government also generally there has been a policy of quite heavy subsidies, fertilizer subsidies to the farmers. So as a result, agricultural production has plummeted. Agricultural exports that we rely on to quite a great extent also have reduced over the months. And as Radhika pointed out, experts, scientists point that in the next season, paddy harvest will come down by 40%. And we also don't have money for imports, food imports. So this is going to result in a very serious impact on food security. It is also the case that we've had two of the areas that we've really been very proud about is the healthcare system, the public healthcare system, and the public education system. Our social indicators have traditionally been very good, including for women in education and healthcare. But today in the public health sector, doctors are making appeals to private donors to give necessary medication and various equipment that are absolutely essential to provide even basic healthcare. This has never happened in Sri Lanka. We are told that only absolutely essential surgeries are being performed in most of the government hospitals. In April 2022, according to central bank statistics, the inflation is 29.8%. So needless to say, the cost of living has soared. The prices of food has soared. So there's hunger. There's already, very widespread hunger. If people at the very low income level had 2 meals a day, it has gone down to 1 meal. This is a very, very serious crisis. And then, of course, essentials are not available. People spend a lot of time in queues for fuel, for cooking gas and the like. Milk foods are not available. Whatever is available is extremely expensive. So, just to put in a nutshell, the way of life has changed dramatically. And my own assessment is that this has really a lot to do with, political governance, which has resulted in this sort of an economic crisis. And then we have to recognize, speaking of human rights in Sri Lanka, of those in the who are employed, 2/3 are employed in the informal sector. So people who rely on daily wages, this has had a very serious impact on those, on that sector, which means the majority of people in the country. People's protest movement, mainly headed by youth of the country. I'm sure you're all very familiar with what happened in Chile. In a way, it is reminiscent of what happened in Chile. It's also reminiscent of the Arab Spring movements in countries because it's very organic. There is no leadership that one can identify with. And the demand is not directly about the economic crisis. Of course, that requires to be resolved, but what is being asked for are structural changes to governance, that there should be accountable governance. And the main demand is that the current president should leave, the presidency should be abolished, and so on and so forth. So, constantly we are having strikes, we are having all of that. And recently, to speak about this human rights nexus to what we are talking about, state-sponsored violence was unleashed on the protesters just this Monday. And it resulted in retaliatory violence, which has left 9 dead and about 300 injured. Emergency has been declared. So all of this being done, currently we are discussing this under a state of emergency. So this is why when we are talking about human rights, while we see the severe impact on economic and social rights due to this economic crisis, we need to really focus on the concept of indivisibility of rights. That's absolutely of the essence, because if people don't have freedom of expression, association, and assembly, because this is how the protest movement has worked out, occupying, like Occupy Wall Street. These youth groups are occupying public squares and public spaces, and there's this effort to get rid of them, and that has a very serious impact on the demands for all rights, including economic and social rights. So of course, in terms of a human rights approach to dealing with the IMF, well, we are informed and we understand, looking at the website of the IMF, it recognizes that a human rights approach to development ought to be achieved. So this is, well, at least at the level of rhetoric, it's there. And 6 elements are identified: active protection of civil liberties, pro-poor budgets and growth strategies, policies geared towards ensuring that people receive adequate food, education, and healthcare. We cannot agree more. Broad participation in policy design, environmental and social awareness, efforts to combat discrimination. Now, this comes from the IMF itself. The point, however, is that while there may be this rhetoric, and we are quite conscious looking at the experiences of other countries which have received extended credit facilities from the IMF of the severe austerity measures, and which can be very specifically focused, through focused conditionalities. So this is where we need to emphasize to our negotiators, and also appeal to the international community in a way that, the human rights situation has to be put in focus, and there has to be a rights approach to this. Constantly in Sri Lanka, from the political establishment, we hear of welfare measures and, welfare safety nets. Our point is, we are no longer talking about welfare, we are talking about rights. One of the problems that we have in the country is that, when you speak of legal obligations, because, I'm sure the entire panel is of the view that, human rights obligations trump everything else, especially when it comes to the obligation to meet co-minimum obligations of human rights. We have a very good ratification record of human rights instruments, including the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, on Civil and Political Rights, and CEDAW, CRC, the Convention on Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and so on, so that, we, in terms of dealing with vulnerable groups, we do have those international obligations. But the point is, our constitutional framework is quite weak. Our Constitutional Bill of Rights mainly focuses on civil and political rights, very few economic and social rights. The Supreme Court has from time to time implied economic and social rights in the Bill of Rights, not as strong as the Indian Supreme Court, for example. So there is that dimension when we speak of constitutional obligations. But of course, we have our international legal obligations that have to be discharged.
We know that the human rights community in general has paid very little attention to economic and social rights. That is historically true. It remains largely true today. A lot of the talk of economic and social rights by many of the major human rights groups really continues to focus overwhelmingly on civil and political rights. That's an issue, I believe, in Sri Lanka as well. Sri Lanka has this heritage. Deepika persuaded me to give the Jennings oration late last year, which in turn plunged me into reading the historical contribution of Sir Ivor Jennings, who absolutely ensured that economic and social rights, unlike in the constitutions of India, Pakistan, Burma, were not anywhere to be seen in Sri Lanka. And that got the Sri Lankan constitutional framework off to what we would see today as a neoliberal approach. And there hasn't been a big change in that regard. So to the extent that the human rights community is going to be able to engage with the IMF on the one hand, but far more importantly, be able to have something to offer to the protesters, it's essential to pick up in a systematic and authentic way on the key importance of economic and social rights as human rights. Deepika mentioned two examples, the Chilean protests and the Arab Spring. The Arab Spring has gone terribly wrong. And perhaps that's not surprising, because one of the elements that was never included was serious redistribution in order to accomplish respect for economic and social rights. Those who thought that their lives had been ruined by dictatorial and corrupt policies got very little other than political squabbling out of the Arab Spring. Chile is trying to go in a different direction. It's moved to a constitutional convention, a thorough revision, which will almost certainly greatly enhance the economic and social rights content. And I think it's very important for Sri Lankan human rights advocates to really grasp the importance of this dimension. Turning to the IMF, I'm not sure where the quote that Deepika provided us with, which she attributed to the IMF, came from, but to my knowledge, the IMF still does not talk about human rights, will insist that these matters are political and therefore outside of its frame of reference or its articles of agreement in legal terms. So talking to the IMF about economic and social rights or about civil and political rights is not going to get very far. And you will see, if you've looked at their documentation on Sri Lanka, that there is no mention of these. A couple of preliminary comments about the future, the negotiations and so on with the IMF. First of all, the IMF language is terribly opaque. They have their own language, which normal people are not meant to understand. Fiscal consolidation, which really translates as austerity. But even a lot of the recommendations, we think, oh, this is getting quite specific. But the average person reading it has no idea what the implications are. Secondly, institutional reform, which has been highlighted by the previous speakers, is outside of the IMF's official remit. It can talk, but usually does so entirely in the abstract, about corruption. But if you look at its analyses of what went wrong, there are no political actors who are culpable. Instead, there are certain policies that were perhaps a little misguided. The tax cuts, the fertilizers, the growing employment in the public sector and so on. These are all issues, but they came from no particular governmental structure. So the extent to which Sri Lanka has been under increasingly, it has to be said, authoritarian rule in recent years is neither here nor there as far as the IMF is concerned. We cannot be political. So the central importance of institutional reform is going to be addressed only very indirectly. Of course, the IMF says it cannot come up with a package until there is a government, and that provides pressure to come up with a new coalition of some sort. But that in turn doesn't imply the sort of deep institutional reforms that are clearly required to move beyond an authoritarian system. When it comes to the IMF itself, first of all, one might hope that other actors like the World Bank and even private donors would provide some sort of leeway for Sri Lanka. But those other donors almost always hitch their wagons to the IMF. In other words, the IMF is the dominant determiner of policies in these areas. Next, remember that the IMF and the World Bank, for all of their fine words, are essentially deeply committed to the promotion of neoliberal values. The World Bank today is little more than an engine to drive privatization. And the IMF goes along with that. That's their overwhelming objective. That is their only real understanding of what it is that drives economic growth. And yet, we know that these neoliberal policy prescriptions have never served the poorer sections of the community well. And so we cannot expect anything different in this case. If we look at what the IMF has said in its so-called Article 4 consultations report, which is the analysis that the fund regularly does of countries' economic performance and what needs to be done, we get some indications of what lies ahead. There is a lot of reference to SSNs. SSNs are social safety nets, but social safety nets are another piece of fund bank speak, which generally bears very limited relationship to economic and social rights as we know them, rights that are recognized constitutionally and form a foundation for policy analysis and prescriptions. That's not what is meant by a social safety net, which is so prominent in the IMF analyses. Instead, the discussion moves very quickly to the favorite, indeed the obsession of the fund and the bank, which is called targeting. And even though the World Bank acknowledges huge both inclusion and exclusion errors, meaning that there are a lot of people getting welfare who shouldn't be, and a lot of people who should be getting it who are not getting it, the IMF moves to its old approach of targeting. In other words, new social registries have to be improved, electronic digital systems have to be improved, and this will enable us to ensure that only the poorest people get assistance. Now, that would be great if it worked in practice, but it never does. And the fund will say, well, we must make sure that enough money is allocated for these purposes, but it never is. And close examples of the fund's policies over recent years show that to be the case. The fund talks obliquely about the need for drastic cuts to capital spending. Now, this can be part of the code for privatization, and one needs to be very conscious of the risks. Deepika spoke of the challenges being confronted by public healthcare and education programs. The solution that the World Bank and thus the IMF are pushing worldwide is the privatization of these services. Governments can't afford them. The private sector does a brilliant job, so let's outsource them. When outsourcing happens, huge profits are made by the private sector, and the people in the lower income deciles are simply served up with a grossly inferior set of services at a hugely inflated cost. And this is going to be a real challenge for Sri Lanka going forward, because even though it's not going to be stated in these terms, that will be a really key part of the actual prescriptions that will come out of the discussions with the IMF. Final word is simply to say, of course, that this process is far from democratic. The coalition that maybe, I don't know, will be announced today is going to have very little wriggle room, is going to be presented with an agenda, and there will be very limited transparency. So it's going to be very difficult for the human rights or other communities to know what exactly is planned. The bottom line then is to go back and say the human rights community needs to really embrace economic and social rights as a starting point in order to make sure also that the demonstrations and so on have a practical target and one that is actually going to bring a better life to those who have suffered from the corruption and self-serving policies that have brought Sri Lanka to its knees. Thank you.
Speaking today in my capacity as someone from Lebanon. Lebanon has experienced very similar things in terms of the collapse of our currency, long-standing corruption, a failure of governance, as we heard from Deepika, mass protests. Our uprising was in October 2020. So I'm speaking from the experience of Lebanon. So I come also in the spirit of camaraderie. And a lot of my teachers and mentors in international law are from Sri Lanka. So I learned my human rights and my international law from people from Sri Lanka. So I hope you recognize I'm here in a spirit of friendship as well. So this is the context from where I'm speaking from. And the challenge, I think, what I learned from Lebanon is how important, and we've heard this in many ways from the other speakers, how important it is the protests are important, the uprising being organic, being from the people, being led by the youth is key. This is the power of this moment. But unless there's a plan and unless people continue organizing in new ways and developing new relationships of solidarity amongst each other, then the protests will not lead to a better political and economic situation. It might even, the future might even be worse than it is today. And I know that's difficult for people to imagine, but this is what we experienced in Lebanon. We weren't able to develop a plan. We were trying, and people were in the streets, and they were really coming together in new ways. They were teaching each other and listening to each other in the streets. They were forming workshops, popular workshops amongst each other. It was the first time people in Lebanon met each other as citizens, as people in the streets, not with all these categories that we have of Christian and Muslim and all of this. It was really a profound moment. What slowed us down in Lebanon was then the pandemic hit. And that slowed down our protest was turning into a plan, into an action plan, but the pandemic stopped it short. And we were demanding our prime minister to leave, and he left, and then the IMF came. And Lebanon, like Sri Lanka, is in the midst of negotiating with the IMF today. And so this also, my theory of change comes in, is that change will happen, proper change, good change will happen through people's ability to organize. So the way I understand human rights is it's important to understand, as we heard from Deepika and from Philip as well, that yes, the Sri Lankan constitution is limited. There's a little bit of wiggle room in that Sri Lanka has signed all the relevant international treaties. Ultimately, though, human rights is people's power. And human rights, as defined by the people, is always what carries through. And this is that moment, sort of to echo all the previous speakers. So by shaping and forming people's claims and concerns in the language of human rights, what's important is all the campaigns around that and the ability of human rights to help people organize themselves and organize with each other. So we heard in terms of the Sri Lankan government, so from a right to food perspective, it is ideal to move away from chemical fertilizers. But the problem, as everyone knows, I think, is the process matters almost more than the content of a policy. And the government did it overnight. They did it without asking rural communities first, what do you want? And in that process of asking what do you want, also has to be, how do we do it together? What's a just transition look like? And so in fact, that idea that people must have the opportunity to provide their input and actively participate in decision-making, this is the key, I think, of what we've been hearing from everyone. So now that the IMF is involved, this, again, I'm not saying anything new, but it shows how bad the situation is in Sri Lanka. Nobody has ever said, hooray, the IMF has arrived. When the IMF comes, it's always begrudging, and you say, I guess now we have to deal with a different awful actor. This is so it's between two awful actors. And again, in Lebanon, it's between the corrupt regime that we had to deal with and the IMF, which has rarely helped most everyday people. This is the choice. I tend to frame things in terms of Lebanon because I am still activist as a special rapporteur, so I'm being a bit careful in terms of how I target my remarks. We've heard that the IMF track record is bleak and is not a good one. And in fact, IMF policies, recommendations, programs often lead to breaking national food systems and often lead to more hunger and often lead to food riots. So they're often not just, it's not that they don't even help, is they often make it worse. So here's how I understand the challenge, that this is the most difficult time for people in Sri Lanka. And what hope there is will come from people's ability to organize under the most extreme circumstances. This is the challenge. And I wonder if maybe other UN agencies or organizations might help, again, helping not just in terms of policies, but help giving that space to help people organize with each other. So people can't trust the IMF and they can't trust the government negotiating. And the worry is that an IMF package will just buttress the existing regime or some other version of people who are not being held accountable. So at the bare minimum, the negotiations between the IMF and the national government needs to be as transparent as possible to the public. But ideally, the negotiations should be also inclusive. There should be some sort of mechanism that allows for people's movements and trade unions to have direct involvement in the negotiations. In human rights, people often focus on the most vulnerable, and this is correct. But to me, that means people who are made vulnerable. That means these are people who have little left to lose and everything to gain. And I think that's a fair demand. There will be pushback on that demand, but I think it's a fair demand. Second, on what is to be done. The IMF, as I was looking on the current special rapporteur on extreme poverty, has an exchange with the IMF, and it's on her website. She has a letter. It's a recent letter she sends to them, and they responded to her. And from that letter from the head of the IMF, the way I understand is that the IMF treats economic stability as a precondition for human rights. And I want to echo and add to what everyone has said today. I think economic, social, and cultural rights can be understood as actually, they are what provides the economic stability. It's not the result. It is actually how you create economic and social stability is through rights. It's through economic and social rights that we can create a system that enables people's lives to flourish. So to get a bit more specific, and I'll conclude here. I read The Urgent Plea by the Women in Media Collective, and I think it's fantastic. I think this is a great example of what a plan can look like, and they've called for others to join them in solidarity. And I'll read their 8 points, especially since we have, we're lucky to have interpreters today. I think these 8 points are a great example of a human rights plan that people